land to the in Motueka West, Plan Change 80. My name's Gary Ray. I'm an independent hearings commissioner appointed by the council to chair this panel, and seated alongside me are
Councillor Kip Mailing, Chair of the Policy and Strategy Committee, and Richmond Ward.
Thank you. And to my right,
Councillor Brett Murray, Motueka Ward Councillor.
Thank you. We're all qualified hearings commissioners to hear this matter. I'd just like to confirm the order of proceedings. Everyone has an agenda. We have a hearing schedule, which may not be long enough for people to present, but we'll certainly give people an opportunity to make their submissions, and we'll have a number of questions. So I'd like to confirm that order, and also just to acknowledge that the panel did issue some pre-hearing questions for the reporting officer, which we expect them to reply today, and that has arrived, and it's in written form, but we'll be shortly going through that. Right. Now, before we start the hearing, are there any matters that any parties wish to raise? If not, we'll proceed. Just point out that the panel has also done a preliminary site visit. We went to the site 2 days ago in the rain and walked around in the long grass and amongst the cattle and so forth, but also walked around the perimeter of the site on Whakariwa Street and on Grey Street to have a look at it. So we've got some familiarisation with it, but that'll help us understand the evidence that's given today. Now, we'll start with the reporting officers and then go to submitters. But first of all, I'd just like to do a roll call so that we know who's in the room. The panel's introduced themselves. We have Marissa Armstrong, who's a very important person for us today. And we'll just quickly go around the room. There's a number of council officers here.
I'm Anna McKenzie, the reporting officer.
Bill Rice, Transport Advisor.
I'm David Stevens, and I'm Stormwater Team Leader, managing the Stormwater Network.
I'm Giles Griffith, Project Manager.
Carry on.
Barry Johnson, I'm the Environment Policy Manager.
John Red, Group Manager, Service and Strategy.
Kia ora, Josh Neville, Team Leader of Development Planning for Kainga Ora.
Good morning, I'm David Ogilvie, a resident of Motueka.
And I understand we have Mr. Sheaves, who's joining us via Zoom. I'm not sure if Mr. Sheaves is on yet, but we may be slightly later than the 10:30 allocated when we come on. So anyway, I think he's aware of that. Right, we've got 2 others. Sorry, yes.
Kia ora koutou, Kim Arnold, and Water and Wastewater Infrastructure Planning for Tasman. Yeah.
And Jeremy Butler, Team Leader for Urban and Rural Policy.
Thank you everyone for attending. There's a number of officers here that with plan changes like this that often involve a lot of other issues and areas that we don't have evidence on, so it's useful to have the staff here. We do have a statement from Mr. Rice, I believe, on the transportation, which we'll come to shortly, but thank you for your attendance. And once we've been through the council officer presentations, you're welcome to stay or leave, whatever suits. You know, you don't have to necessarily stay for the duration. But, all right, I think we're ready to get underway, and we'll hand over to you, Ms. McKenzie. And thank you very much for providing those written answers. As noted, it's not an exhaustive list, but it sort of gets things underway, and it highlights the issues that the panel are aware of at this stage of proceedings. And I think it might be most efficient if you were to go through those and to add any other matters that might help. We've got 20 odd minutes, but we'll take longer if necessary. Thank you.
Right, thank you. So I'll just summarise the plan change to start with, and then I'll go on to some detail around those the questions that were raised. The objective of Plan Change 80 is to provide for housing and encourage intensification through the provision of compact density development. The plan change is responding to issues around the direction given in the future development strategy, which has identified this land for residential intensification. Also, regional-wide issues around the need to provide for population growth, the National Policy Statement on Urban Development, which requires councils to make sufficient land available for housing and business growth in the short, medium and long term. It's also responding to the issue around Motueka's high demand for housing land and the limitations with regards to land that is suitable for redevelopment, particularly land that is close to public transport and amenities. In order to address these issues, this plan change is seeking to rezone a greenfield parcel of land, which is shown on the screen there, that is in single ownership and is subject of an Infrastructure Acceleration Fund housing outcome agreement. The intent of the Infrastructure Acceleration Fund was to provide financial support towards some of the transport, wastewater and stormwater upgrades to facilitate the future development of this land in the short, medium term. The plan change land is proposed to be rezoned from Rural 1 deferred residential, which it currently is in the TRMP, to residential with compact density provisions to encourage the medium density housing by applying the Tasman Resource Management Plan existing compact density provisions, with an additional non-notified provision to incentivise the use of the compact density provisions. It also includes adjustments to the indicative road network, walkways and reserves, and several amendments to the Tasman Resource Management Plan rule framework, which are outlined in the documentation. I'll now go through those key questions that were raised by the panel in a bit more detail. Firstly, the inclusion of the pedestrian crossing as an indicative item. Submitter Te Whataora support the inclusion of the requirement for an integrated transport assessment, but sought in their submission the inclusion of a pedestrian crossing from the Plan Change 80 site across Whakarewa Street to the high school. Historically, indicative roads, walkways and reserves have only been shown on private land and not on public land such as legal roads. Planning for road, reserves and open space is normally left to the relevant teams in council. Plan Change 80 as notified requires that an integrated transport assessment be undertaken at the resource consent stage. This assessment is expected to determine the need for the traffic measures such as crossings and appropriate locations. I consider that this is appropriate because it will need to be determined at the time of the development, the extent to which the development triggers the need for a crossing. I do not consider the process of rezoning the land to be the correct time to determine detailed interventions such as a pedestrian crossing.
We'll just take questions as we go, if that's okay with you. I'll just ask my panel if we have any questions on that. Yep. Thank you for that. And when we did the site visit, we were curious as to where that pedestrian crossing might go. It appears there's at least 2 access strips through to the main road, and there could potentially be a third one. We weren't quite sure because the planning map shows a red line that looks like it might be there. But I guess the key thing is the information that you're giving us is that will be determined at the time of resource consent. Are any of those strips in the appropriate location for a crossing, a pedestrian crossing? Does it align nicely with the entrance to the school, for instance? Mr. Rice might answer that.
Yeah. The accesses don't specifically line up with the entrance to the school, but they're within a reasonable walking distance, and you potentially wouldn't need to go right and go to the right and then across and come back again. But yeah.
It's workable, you think?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I mean, for our consideration as a plan change, we just need to be aware that there's a workable solution at this stage here.
Yeah.
We'll go to the next item, Ms. McKenzie.
Integrated transport assessment. The notified application includes the requirement for an integrated transport assessment, as I've said, and for this to be taken at the resource consent stage. It's part of the Infrastructure Acceleration Fund application. There was a high-level assessment of traffic requirements on Whakarewa Street at the intersection with the plan change site. The assessment determined the requirements for a roundabout at the Manoi Street, Whakarewa Street intersection, where it aligns with the plan change site. The fund has provided some funding for this intersection in its improvements. There currently is no funding in Council's 10-year plan for additional roading works or improvements other than those already commissioned for the project through the Infrastructure Acceleration Fund. However, if confirmed as a requirement by the Integrated Transport Assessment, the TDC Transport Manager has indicated that due to its relative low costs, the Council may be able to fund the installation of a safe crossing point at a suitable location on Whakarewa Street, linking to the walking cycling corridor from the development and across to the school. It is very unlikely that the full impacts of development from the plan change area will be raised immediately, as the development of the proposed 200 houses, as outlined in the Infrastructure Acceleration Fund agreement, is scheduled to be staged from 2024 to 2029. There may be limited opportunities to include funding for any identified upgrades in Council's 2027-37 long-term plan. In previous plan changes undertaken by Council, it's been left to the resource consent stage to undertake an integrated transport assessment. In some cases, the land is deferred until transport upgrades, as informed by the integrated transport assessment, are undertaken. Are there any questions?
Just over that period of time, what increased number of traffic movements would you expect? Because if we're talking 200 houses and, you know, the average number of vehicles and then the traffic movement. Because we had a problem crossing the high street ourselves because of the level of traffic that there is currently. And I'm just concerned about the increase.
So typically, some recent surveys suggest about 6 to 8 vehicles a day from a residential development. The NZTA guidance sits at about 10. And so I would expect somewhere in that 6 to 8 vehicles per day. So 1,200 to 1,600 extra vehicles. Now, whether all of them would go out through Whakarewa and High Street is a question. But I was working on about 80% going to Whakarewa High.
Thanks, Bill. So in terms of the traffic movement, so this has addressed the access to Whakarewa Street, but it's pretty light in terms of commentary and assessment around impact of State Highway and how that accesses. So if there's another 1,000 movements a day, because we did cross at around 2:30 before school and had to walk further down the road to get across. So what planning has been done and what pre-assessments has been done to address that impact on the State Highway network?
We've done some preliminary modelling at that peak time, and that is certainly indicating that the numbers at that intersection will increase significantly at the school finish time, which is the peak time on High Street as well. So interestingly, the High Street peak is during that time rather than the morning or evening peaks.
Just through the chair report, and so as part of that assessment, has there been any mitigations or solutions considered or thought of or discussed?
There had been some discussion about a signalised crossing, a signalised intersection as part of the Transport Choices project. And that had been assumed in the early stages of this project. And so that is probably not happening at the timing that was understood in the Transport Choices time. So
my final one was, Chair, just for clarity for the panel. So would it be correct that that is not part of Transport Choices options anymore? So there is currently no plan in for any treatment?
No.
Thank you.
Yeah, I've got a couple of transportation questions. They might be planning, they might be transportation, but just from a strategic viewpoint, if you like, this site is part of a wider area of the Motueka West development area. And my question is, what role does the council have in providing infrastructure upgrades as part of the development of that land? Or does it have a role? And secondly, is it deferred back to developers when they do their individual parcels of land for them to either fund it or come up with some agreement with council to fund it? Is there any responsibility on council to provide infrastructure to an area they've zoned for future development? That's the first question.
Typically, the developer would be responsible for specific items that really only serve their development. And then council would pick up responsibility for broader items and include them in development contributions funded through.
With the state highway intersection that we've just talked about, that's NCTA's responsibility. Just, Ms. McKenzie, can you remind me, they did lodge a submission, but they're not taking part in this hearing. What's their perspective on this proposal?
They're supportive of the proposal and the location of the site. They did indicate through discussions early on that there was some concerns about the safety aspects around the intersection. And we did have discussions with them at that time. When the plan change was notified, it was included, the signalling of that intersection was included as part of the transport fund agreement, transport choices. Yes, but it's now no longer.
Would it be fair to say that there's funding available to do roading improvements? It's just a matter of design, and at the right time, the application is lodged for resource consent, and then things like vehicle generation, design are all dealt with at that stage. But it appears to us that there's funding available to do it through that agreement. Is that fair, or does it have to go through another process of long-term planning?
At this stage, it would have to go through the long-term plan process, and if it does involve the state highway, there would then also need to be some discussion about how much of the issues there are existing issues and should be funded by NCTA as an existing situation. And certainly I don't think NCTA have any funding available or funding programmed for that intersection.
Now, sorry about this, but final question on transportation for now. We understand there's a resource consent application with council on hold at the moment for a much larger area of land, including this block of land. We'd like to be aware of any likely conditions that would arise. In other words, what responsibility does the wider development of the land have for roading improvements? And because this is being run under plan change, we've got a resource consent in the system at the same time. I'm just not quite sure how mitigation relates to this site and to the wider consent. Is there anything you can help us with on that, so understand that?
The resource consent was submitted prior to the plan change being notified. So as far as I understand from the planner that's assessing it, it hasn't been assessed at this point under the provisions of the notified plan change, because it was submitted prior to. And as I said, I suppose as part of the plan change, we are hoping that the integrated transport assessment requirement will be included. There is a requirement in the TRN, the Tasman Resource Management Plan, for traffic effects to be considered. And from what I understand, there has been a report submitted, but it may not be to the level of an integrated transport assessment, which looks at the wider impacts.
Thanks, I understand that. Thank you very much. All right. If there's any further questions, we'll move on to the next point. Thank you.
Okay, stormwater effects. The stormwater modelling for the development has considered flows within the development area, but has not considered extra infrastructure for a large additional area. Council's long-term plan includes some budget beyond 10 years for the stormwater corridor to the west and south of the plan change development area. So as you can see on the map, that's the green line through this, yeah. centre there that's included within our Tasman Resource Management Plan currently. The council's community infrastructure team has advised that the installation of this future greenway may relieve some capacity in the current stormwater pipeline that caters for the Plan Change 80 development and may provide additional capacity for a small number of additional properties bordering the Plan Change 80 development area. Should you have any further questions around stormwater, we have David and Giles and also Kim available.
In terms of the stormwater, there's a submission from Kangaroa about including a wider area, which basically goes around the perimeter along High Street and then Whakaira Street. So it's that housing basically around up High Street and then turn left. What impact would that have on the stormwater and what financial impact? So one is capacity, two is finance, because they're both relevant going forward.
Can you just assist me in outlining just exactly what area Kangaroa are proposing? So our approach to applications to connect to our network, generally through the resource consent process, is to where we're constrained with infrastructure, which we are in Motueka, is to require some on-site mitigation, detention, and that type of approach. So that's consistent with our approach to the current application for the Wakatu land, is looking for detention, some discharge to soakage, and then an overflow, if you like, into our network. We'd need to look at that, the capacity of that line, and see if if the applicant was able to make arrangements to attenuate some of that flow. In the longer term, when that southern project comes through, that will relieve some of the pressure off this new pipe that's gone from the N-rate property through to Woodlands Drain. So we're probably in a bit of a pinch point. We need to consider pretty carefully about what sort of mitigation they were able to provide if they're doing development. But I wouldn't say no, but we'd need to just carefully work through it.
Would it be similar to if I look at what's happened in Richmond when people are doing infill, they do retention tanks and then release it all at a time, or they do soak pits, or they have other tanks that just hold the water? Would that be similar?
Yeah, most likely. Yeah.
I think so, David. This is I'm sorry, through the chair. So in terms of the report, actually, let's go back to so it's the analyst report. So on page 16, we've got the 1% AEP storm scenario mapping for 2090, and then we've got the discussion around stormwater. Stormwater from Motueka West goes to east. Does the hazard map have any impact in terms of where does the stormwater flow if that hazard map is right at 1% AEP? And do we have to consider that now, or is that just two things that have considered separately?
Can I just check what page we're on?
So the map's on page 16. And it's just the flood hazard mapping at 1% AEP, which shows currently what we're projecting. So my question about the discharge is the discharge goes to the west, so there's already water there. Where does discharge go to?
From the west, where does the discharge? At the moment, before the pipe was installed, we had ponding in the west across all that horticultural land, and then in larger events flows across High Street, down Rat Street, and then to Woodlands Drain slowly through that existing network.
Yep. No, so I get the mitigate. I get so that pipe's brilliant. But if we have sea level rise and we have increased water on the east side of High Street, we currently discharge. So Woodlands Drains to the where will it go? So where will we mitigate stormwater from the west of High Street when it's got nowhere to go across the road to east?
Sure.
And have we considered that?
Sure. So in the longer term, if the work proposed in the LTP continues, we'll have that further discharge from the site down through, mostly out through Courtney Street into the lower estuary that's still protected by the wharf road gates there. So the wharf road gates currently protect against the high tide and provide that flood capacity in the estuary. So in the short term, we just have that discharge into Woodlands Drain, which is protected by gates at Old Wharf Road and at Wharf Road. In the longer term, we'll have a discharge going to the south and then through Courtney Street. And again, that's protected by the Wharf Road gates. I'm not sure that the Anna can probably help me. Figure 3, I think there is assuming that there's no protection of Wharf Road gates. Is that correct?
I'm unsure, actually. That's our flood mapping bathtub model.
Yeah, we'd need to go away and check that, but my working assumption on that would be that that's assuming that there's no protection from Wharf Road anymore.
And just finally, so the expectations in terms of coping with infrastructure is that there'd be some sort of retention in terms of development.
Is this for further development?
Oh, for this plan change development. So this current 200 lot housing lot, is there expectations there'll be some form of retention?
Yes, that's right. So their proposal as it stands at the moment in the consent application is for some on-site treatment and also detention with 2 reasonably large detention areas with overflows to the network, and also designed so that the 2 detention basins discharge to groundwater as well.
You can proceed with that point. There's also the issue of scope. Is that you're going to address that? Yeah.
What's that, sorry?
It's also the issue of scope.
Yes, I'm going to address that next. I thought I'd separate that out. So my next point is the inclusion of the additional land within the spatial extent of the plan change area. Kāinga Ora in their submission have requested an extension to the spatial area, which was just pointed out by Councillor before, which includes the housing along High Street and Pokerewa Street. On reflection, I request an amendment to the Section 42A report to reject the submission points 4215, 01, 02 and 03 on the basis that they are out of scope. Extending the proposed compact density residential zone would include additional properties not owned by the submitter, and it would result in a significant number of landowners who would not have a real opportunity for participation as potentially affected landowners. As such, I recommend that the submission points are out of scope.
Okay. Mr. Neville, we'll be interested to hear what your response is to that. But just to clarify things, can you just remind us, Ms. McKenzie, what was the reason for this particular parcel to be dealt with in isolation to the rest in terms of this one is quite confined? What was the main reason for that?
This parcel, as I've said, is part of the Infrastructure Acceleration Fund agreement, which has brought forward infrastructure improvements to enable the development of it in the short to medium term. So we know we've got a shortage of housing in Motueka, and for us it was an opportunity to get a quick gain, I suppose, in terms of getting some houses on the ground, and to do that to support any application for compact density development in this area. We would need a plan change to do that.
That's explained in the purpose statement for the plan change, isn't it? Yeah.
Correct.
We'll move on from that point. Thank you very much.
Okay, the status of the resource consent. To date, the subdivision application to create 12 new residential leasehold super lots has not been granted. It's currently on hold under Section 92 due to outstanding issues. There are several other consents bundled in with this application, including a land use consent for reduced setback requirements to a Rural 1 zone, a land disturbance consent to undertake bulk earthworks, and a stormwater discharge consent. These consents are all on hold pending further information. In regards to my reference in the Section 42A report for the super lot stage, this was to align with the wording of Wakatu Corporation and their submission point. So I was aligning my wording with theirs, and also in the resource consent, the development is considered or described as super lots, I suppose.
I still don't know what it means, but I think I know. Does a super lot mean that they're quite large lots and that the normal sort of setbacks and boundary setbacks don't apply because it's a large lot and development can happen without all those constraints? Or what does it mean in planning terms?
Well, the super lot, it's not defined in our Tasman Resource Management Plan, but my understanding is that they're larger lots. I suppose Wakatu Corporation will be able to describe better their intentions around that.
It may be better if I'll put this question to Wakatu Corporation, but does that the super lots mean that they'll put multiple dwellings on there, or maybe they're talking about papakaing? Is that what you envisage, or?
I direct that question to the landowner.
I don't see them online yet, so I'll wait till they. Thank you.
We'll come to that.
We're here. We can answer that question if you like. I'm not sure if we're on video.
No.
Are we? Yes. Can you see us? Can you hear us?
Yes, we can, Mr. Sheaves. Thank you for answering that now. It's a good time to do it.
Okay. Sure. Well, actually, I was going to, in my submission, hopefully share a scheme plan with you and talk you through it. But at a high level, in terms of the super lots, we're creating service lots, which will then be passed on leasehold basis to housing providers who will then undertake comprehensive housing developments on those super lots. So multiple dwellings, different housing providers have different mechanisms for delivering affordable housing, multi-occupancy housing or apartments or whatever it might be that fits with their delivery model. And so they have an element of freedom within that super lot to execute their comprehensive development to align with their funding and delivery remit.
Thank you, Mr. Sheaves. That's all we need to know for now, but that sort of confirms our understanding of what they would be. So thank you for that, and we'll possibly come back to that when you do your presentation. So thank you. I think we'll move on to the next point now, Ms. McKenzie. Thank you.
Okay, my next point is around the natural hazards. The plan change land is currently Rural 1 deferred residential, as I've said, for servicing, and is earmarked in the future development strategy for intensification. This was following a high-level natural hazard assessment. The plan change Section 32 evaluation report includes an assessment of the natural hazard risk, including flooding, coastal inundation, and seismic risk. In this report, Council's Senior Resource Scientist Glenn Stevens, who will be online now, or will be shortly, notes that the Council's current liquefaction mapping shows that the plan change 80 site and its wider vicinity is an area where a seismic liquefaction could possibly occur. Mr. Stevens has provided further advice that this advice is based on the underlying strata comprising of unconsolidated and geologically recent sediments. At the plan change 80 site, these sediments are expected to be predominantly river gravels and not subject to liquefaction hazard. The presence of pockets of fine-grained sediment, such as sand and silts in places, such as an old infill river channel or buried sandbar, cannot be ruled out in this case. Where such unconsolidated fine gravel sediments are present and associated with high groundwater levels, they could present a localised liquefaction hazard. Any such pockets of fine-grained sediments are not expected to be widespread across the plan change site and are able to be managed through appropriate engineering solutions. A detailed geotechnical assessment is required at the resource consent stage, which would determine the actual ground conditions present. Any resource consent application would then need to account for any such fine-grained sediments, if present, and outline the mitigation measures to be adopted. So Mr. Stevens is online if you have any. Excellent. If you have any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Stevens, for coming along. I haven't got any questions myself, but I'll just check with the panel. So, there's no questions at this stage. Right. Now, does the panel have any questions of the officers that we haven't in this order?
Sorry, I've got one more point. One final point, which is around the indicative roads and reserves. WOC2 and Corporation have requested through their submission that the notified indicative roads and reserves be amended to reflect the resource consent application that is currently being assessed by Council. The location of these roads and reserves were notified following discussions with the landowner and a review of their concept master plan. Since notifying the plan change, the landowner has amended their master plan and sought consent. To date, this consent has not been granted, and any further changes to the roading and reserve layout may result prior to the consent being approved. Retaining the indicative roads and reserves as notified does not prevent the landowner from adjusting the location of the reserves and roads as they are indicative only, which means there's some flexibility in their final location. So it's considered appropriate that the final location be determined at that subdivision stage of the resource consent application. That's my final comments. Thank you.
Yeah, I understand the discussion there. And as we understand it, the indicative roads are just that, they're indicative, and whilst the resource consent might show them in a slightly different place, that shouldn't be an impediment to the provision of them, because they basically have to connect that point with that point roughly along that. Is that right? So they're not designations, they're just indicative alignments.
Correct.
It's just a question of stormwater, and it's probably more for David Stevenson. So does this subdivision, well, not subdivision, does this plan change have an impact on your current capacity? In other words, will the proposed mitigation change the capacity that you've currently got?
It's likely there'll be a small impact, but no more than minor in terms of on the Woodlands drain. It's most likely to be at those larger events, and if Giles has got more information he wants to bring, that would be helpful. But my understanding is that it's likely to be very minor in those smaller events, and still quite minor in the large events. And then the longer term plan, and that's in those scenarios for climate change and sea level rise, and that the longer term plan, as we discussed before, was that wider discharge to the south, which will intercept some of that flow that's coming from the west into the subdivision, and particularly in the short term. And with our approach to dealing with resource consents for development in this area is to mitigate as much as possible so that the discharges are no greater than the current discharge.
Thank you for that.
Thank you very much. That deals with the officer's presentation at this point, and we will come back. And also we note that the submitters have raised matters that they may wish to respond to, particularly Mr. Ogilvie on the stormwater and flooding issues, which we'll come back to. All right, we'll now proceed to submitters. And first of all, I've got Mr. Sheaves, who we've already had a quick discussion with. Mr. Sheaves, welcome along. Thanks for joining in. We're in your hands now. If you wanted to address that point you just did and then go on to your other points. Thank you very much.
Sure. Well, what I thought I might actually do, I've got Hayden Taylor from Planscapes here to assist me. what I thought I'd do is just go through a little bit of the history and a little bit of the plan around the development plans for the site. I might even touch on the stormwater, which we've done quite a bit of work on just to clarify that. And at some point I might share a plan if I'm permitted to do so, just around the actual development plan. So first, I'd just like to thank you for the opportunity to address the hearing, and to the TDC officers for preparing the report. Wakatu is a Marian corporation with land holdings across Te Taurihu, a particular concentration of corpus lands in Motueka. In 2015, Plan Change 43, Motueka West, became operative, and this rezoned approximately 100 hectares of land to the west of State Highway 6 as deferred residential, mixed business and industrial zones based on the projected growth of Motueka over the next 80 years. Waka Kotahi was consulted on this plan change. In 2016, Wakatu undertook development of 143 section in the Tanapukeko Hatu subdivision off Grey Street within the Motueka West zone. And this is an innovative project producing smaller freehold sections to provide housing at a more market-friendly price point. And although this was helpful to some extent, housing was still out with the reach of many in the community. Soon afterwards, Wakatu also partnered with a local fruit exporter, Golden Bay Fruit, to develop a significant fruit packing and storage facility within the industrial zone of Motueka West. So Motueka West is underway. These projects were beset with challenges caused by limited servicing to the area and required servicing upgrades and interim solutions to progress. Essentially, the area rezoned was underserviced. Motueka suffers from a significant housing challenge with poor housing stock and insufficient supply. As a significant local landowner and employer, and having a duty of care to its owners and the wider Motueka community, Wakatu identified that by creating long-term leasehold serviced land blocks, super lots, these could be offered to housing providers to develop comprehensive housing projects to provide a range of housing options for the community. One of the key elements of the project is that the land can be made available for long-term secure housing, but the areas of corpus land retained for future generations to redevelop to provide a built environment fitting for the requirements at that time. Critical to the scheme is for the overall freehold land holding to remain intact with no servicing corridors or road reserves vested in TDC or other parties. Instead, a series of leases and easements be used to give the council security required to undertake their statutory duties in the provision of services. In 2000, the IAF scheme was announced by the government, which required a tripartite agreement between Kāinga Ora, TDC and the developer. The council would accelerate services required to allow the land to be developed. Kāinga Ora would provide funding towards these services, and the developer would undertake to service sufficient land for 200 dwellings on a leasehold basis and grant the necessary leases to allow housing providers to undertake comprehensive development. Waka Kotahi was consulted on the IAF project. Independent to this work, Waka Kotahi undertook a review of State Highway 6 in Motueka and identified a number of upgrade works required. Some of these were completed and some were not included, including in the upgrade of the intersection between State Highway and Wakarewa Street. This intersection has been identified as below service level for a number of years. At the time of the IF application, the upgrade was allowed for in the Transport Choices funding, but these works did not proceed. It's Wakatu's position that any upgrade to the intersection is an issue between Waka Kotahi and the council due to wider issues with this intersection being linked to wider traffic issues in Motueka rather than specifically this development. I'll just touch also on stormwater because that was raised a little moment ago. The challenge with stormwater in Motueka is that this land is upstream from High Street, and when water comes across the relatively flat but slightly graded land down towards High Street, it does back up and has caused flooding in the past. When I share my plan, and it might be I might just try and do that now, if that's possible. I think I need a. Oh dear.
Can you move that bar, that black bar, to close that window down?
Ah, there we go. Can the panel see that?
Thank you.
Yeah. This probably gives the best indication. As you can see in the center of the development area and down to the southeast is the stormwater infrastructure. What this actually does is it captures most of the stormwater traveling across from west to east through the current undeveloped Motueka West area and forms it into detention areas marked on the plan, and then discharging them at a set rate into downstream into the woodlands drain. So in actual fact, the development reduces the runoff from the wider area quite considerably, and I'm afraid I wasn't aware that was a point for discussion. So I don't have the actual data and flow rates to hand, but if the panel would like that forwarded to them, I can do that going forward. So things to note from this plan: we can see the super lots, which are arranged throughout the development. It would be a staged development with stage one being sort of northeast corner, and then progressing in a sort of clockwise direction. There's access to the site for stage one from Whakarewa Street, and in the final stages, access through Grey Street. As noted, significant stormwater detention acts as a cut-off drain and management mechanism for stormwater for the wider Motueka West site. And there in the middle, there you could see there is a multi-use reserve with stormwater management and recreation. The resource consent for the project was applied for in August 2023, and currently outstanding matters are details regarding the easements, which I referred to before, and the transport matters which we've been discussing to be addressed. Now, I could take some questions at the moment, or I can pass over to Hayden Taylor, who might make some comments of more technical nature. Is there a preference?
Yeah, thank you for that. We probably don't need to know any more detail about the resource consent or the development of the land. We're here mainly concerned about the zoning of it and whether there are any impediments to us rezoning it. And what we're getting in evidence is that these matters will be shown in a detailed resource consent, which is currently on hold. So that's the key bit of information there. But Mr. Sheaves, in terms of the indicative road discussion we had earlier, are you comfortable with the officer's explanation that the indicative road need not line up with what's shown on the resource consent? Mr. Taylor might be able to advise you on that. But first of all, have you got any concerns with that recommendation?
I think from practical point of view, there's been quite a lot of work has gone into devising the current road network to align with stormwater and various other constraints that we work to, including significant time spent engaging with council officers across various different departments to put together a workable solution that meets the multiple different requirements of a roading network. So I would see that aligning the indicative road network with the current application would not be an impediment. And because obviously if there's any future change to that roading network between now and the development, it would be on for firm reasons and could be dealt with through a variation of the resource consent, presumably.
I'm not sure, Mr. Taylor, whether you wanted to add any comment. We haven't got any evidence from you, so I've got to be a bit careful how far I take this. But as a planner, do you concur that the road alignment, indicative road, is not limiting as to the precise location of it? Is that something you're still concerned with?
Thank you, Commissioner. No, I think in principle, I agree with that viewpoint entirely. That the alignment, I mean, they're there to show essentially key connections, those indicative roads. In practice, we have had through the resource consent process some challenge in satisfying some council officers about that, who have been quite keen to stick to the precise alignment and of those roads. But I agree with that in principle, that there is some flexibility provided there, that they are indicative. One thing I would point out is that the submission point that Wakatu made on this also related to the indicative reserves, and the same principle applies there. One thing I would point out though is that, as you can see in the plan that's in front of you there, of the areas of indicative reserve shown in the planning maps, part of them in practice are proposed to be vested as recreation reserve, and part as stormwater reserve. And so I think ideally the planning maps would reflect just the recreation reserve elements of those to avoid any confusion.
Thank you for that. That is in the submission. So I'm just wondering, Ms. Mackenzie, did you respond to that one, or are you able to respond to the reserves one rather than the roading? We'll just take a response from Ms. Mackenzie now.
Yes, I had the same response in that it's indicative and yeah, it is flexible in its final location.
We're being told the same principle would apply to reserves as it does to indicative roads. Just Mr. Sheaves and Mr. Taylor, in terms of the provisions, the track changes and the amendments that are being recommended to the plan change, are there any aspects that you've raised in your submission on those which you'd like to address us on?
Yes, so those track changes were principally to do with two things. One was where there's a pathway for consent for comprehensive development that involves both land use and subdivision, that enables a non-notification clause to be used. And as it's worded at the moment, that the proposed provisions would only enable that pathway to be obtained if both subdivision and land use are proposed at the same time. Now, I agree with the principle of that. The idea, I think, is to ensure that that developments for comprehensive housing are assessed as holistically as possible, and that's great. Where I see an issue with that is that not all developments of these super lots will necessarily involve both subdivision and land use consent. As Mr. Shevers explained earlier, there are sort of various sort of housing models that might involve social housing and so forth that will never be further subdivided. And so ideally, the provisions would acknowledge that and enabling that non-notified pathway for those circumstances as well. And it would require just some minor wording changes, I think, to just perhaps make clear that where subdivision and land use is the ultimate outcome, they should be applied for together. But where subdivision is not proposed at all, you could still get the benefit of those comprehensive housing provisions that enable non-notification.
Yes, and Ms. McKenzie has addressed that in her report. I can't put my finger on where that is exactly, but did you have any response to the way the officer has addressed that one, responded to it?
I believe Ms. McKenzie's response was that the provisions should stay as they are because as perhaps she didn't quite understand the point that I was making in that submission, and that she's just reiterated the point, I think, that that applications should be applied for holistically with subdivision and land use consent, but perhaps not acknowledging that both those aspects might not always occur. Perhaps I've misread that, but Ms. McKenzie might get to clarify.
Yeah, well, maybe we could save that one for the reply, if you like.
Sure.
Yeah, thank you. That is of interest to us because you're seeking a pathway for both land use and subdivision if they're done separately. So we'll ask Ms. McKenzie to respond to that at the end of the process. So I think that's what
I'm sorry, Commissioner. There was one more aspect of that track changes that I would like to touch on, and that is in relation to the two sets of boundary controls that apply. Those that are apply to boundaries that are external to the plan change area or to a boundary where compact density provisions haven't been utilised to develop that land. And Ms. McKenzie's response to that, I believe, was that where that occurs internal to the site, Wakatu Incorporation should be able to give their own written approval to exceed those boundary controls, such as daylighting. In practice, there may be other parties involved at that point through some of the housing providers. So I think that was the point that I just wanted to clarify in relation to that submission point, and perhaps Ms. McKenzie could respond to that as well in reply. But we just don't want to have a situation where a super lot, for example, has not yet been developed and it's got some level of control by another party, and that then inhibits the full utilisation of the compact density provisions on an adjacent lot within the development. Obviously, on the external boundaries of the plan change area, that's absolutely expected to utilise the more restrictive boundary controls, but we don't want to see situations where that inhibits the full development potential within the site, basically.
Yeah, yes, we'll come back to that in the reply. And just in terms of that super lot development, how does that stack up in terms of the plan change provisions? Would that be provided for in the plan change provisions? I know it's being dealt with as a separate resource consent, but how does that relate to the plan change?
Okay. Yeah, I mean, essentially the plan change is putting it in place the framework for compact density development and comprehensive development that will enable the further development of those lots. So the current application that's shown in that plan on the screen creates the land parcels that will then utilise those compact density provisions through further resource consent applications for land use and possibly subdivision.
So if plan change 80 was approved, would that make the environment better for Wakatu in developing this land, or would it continue to proceed with its resource consent under the current provisions? Is there any preference on that?
Yeah, I mean, it certainly enables what Wakatu seeks to achieve on the site. If the plan change weren't to go ahead, and that would just mean that the subsequent development of those super lots would be enabled to a far less intensive density, basically.
Thank you very much. Mr. Sheaves, is there anything else you'd like to address us on?
No, that's everything. Thank you.
Very much for that. That's very useful. All right, we'll carry on with submissions, and we've got Mr. Ogilvie who's been waiting patiently there. Welcome, Mr. Ogilvie. Thanks for supplying your written statements, which we have. You were down for 10 minutes, but I'm sure that's not going to be enough. So we're happy for you to have a bit longer than that. So just in your hands.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. And I'll skip paragraph 1 of my statement, which I sent out a day or two back. Number 2, the plan change 80 for Motueka West is a significant stage in Motueka's growth, given the opportunity for further residential subdivision on the eastern and the coastal side of our town is currently constrained. I am actually quite sorry that this area of very high quality productive soils will be lost to urban developments. But it is accepted that if Motueka is to grow beyond a population of 10,000, then the loss of highly productive soils is an unfortunate consequence. And intense development that Ian has just talked about will partly offset this loss. My submission endeavoured to highlight some opportunities and some issues which the Motueka West proposal suggested, not particularly relevant to the zoning plan change. Therefore, I wasn't surprised when the land ownership and the swimming pool aspects to my submission were designated as out of scope by the council planners. Regarding land ownership, I was underlining the unusual aspect of Wakatuna Corporation and possibly N-Rate retaining ownership, not only for residential sections, but also the public infrastructure, roads, paths, reserves, and through waters. I can appreciate the considerable cultural significance for our local iwi of this particular Motueka West area, being part of Te Matu and with at least 2 occupation reserves per the current 10th claim. Wakatu will have its own cultural doubts regarding the future of this area, perhaps even now. As the report fully indicated, there will be legal discussions to resolve the relationships between the property owner developer and the district council with this situation. Perhaps it's not unlike the recent Motueka River stop bank matter being resolved at the October 2024 council meeting. The Motueka swimming pool. My submission was written in February when a location of the pool, the site, considered the Wakatuna Corporation as the landowner developer would be required to provide a reserve as part of its development contribution. With the Motueka High School, the Parkland School and Moki Kahatu subdivision reasonably close, an arrangement with the district council for a pool on that reserve would have been financially quite beneficial for each party. And I pose the question even now, perhaps it's not too late for the council's management to scope that financial possibility. Stormwater management for Motueka West and the resulting stormwater discharge into the woodlands drain was the primary objective of my submission. This plan change 80 provides the opportunity to establish a low-risk management system for this sizable area of our town, and also to relieve the capacity problem of the woodlands drain. I was blindsided and bewildered by the Management Report 42, which advised the hearing panel to reject my submission. This concern increased when I read that resource consents RM 240322 and RM 191019 were factors for this reject recommendation. RM 200322 is not directly relevant to Motueka West, while RM 191019 is actually a global consent covering all the district's stormwater urban development areas. Neither provides the detail for stormwater management for the 2 areas that I'm concerned about, that is, Motueka West and the woodlands drain discharge. And surely these are also the council's details they are looking for. This would be to provide the details of a management program to protect the future residents in Motueka West from a 1 in 100 year, 1% AUP heavy rain event. Equally important is to provide sufficient capacity in the woodlands drain to protect those who currently discharge into that drain. That includes Sand Lane Drive residents, Motueka High School, New World Supermarket, the Motueka Recreation Centre, Goodman Park, and others. These people and places will require similar comfort and protection from the wall of water from Motueka West, perhaps also at a 100-year, 1% AUP level. I've got in those notes, refer to the outlet photographs. Now, 2 pages further on, I've got the photographs of those quite large culverts. It's on both sides of your paper, just to show the extent of the water which is expected to go towards the woodlands drain. Yet the woodlands drain currently has quite significant limited capacity. And one of my probably major concerns is that that capacity, now limited, will suffer. And that may impact, of course, on those people who currently discharge into the drain. I'm trying to explain. The woodlands drain was developed in the late 1990s, basically to relieve pressure on the Thorpe drain. A Montgomery Watson Hazard report, that stage they were the council consulting engineers in the year 2000, and perhaps another in 2004, noted the limited capacity at about a 1 in 20 year level. We've had 20 years of weed growth, sediment and soil, plus of course a lot of additional discharge points with housing and the likes. This means the current capacity possibly is at even a 1 in 10 year event. I was hoping the panel may actually walk down the Woodlands Canal when you met the other day, because it really needs some attention currently. The two situations, of course, Motueka West and the drain, are interrelated. The standard methods used by the council to regulate and handle heavy rain events in Motueka would be drains, soak pits, retention ponds, narrower roads, single footpaths, grass berms and trees. I have mentioned and endeavoured to emphasise the need for perhaps more on-site, what's called self-management of stormwater. In particular, install or have installed or allow to be installed rainwater tanks of say 3 cubic metres or 5 cubic metres with each dwelling consent. And for those who may be surprised by the innovation of that, this is not new for Motueka. If you were to build a new dwelling in the eastern or coastal side of Motueka, it needs to observe the climate change mitigation standards, which council is requiring. It's for flooring level and for stormwater. This requires a 3 or 5 cubic metre rainwater tank to receive the first flush of any rain to be discharged later. And this is also becoming common, I believe, in some US states and parts of Australia. There are various options to relieve the woodlands drain. Deepening, widening the drain, the preferable best protection could be perhaps a water pump to offset the existing very low gradient flow along the drain towards the tidal gate and then out into the Motueka Inlet or estuary. Item 5 of my report, the council has a number of programs and reports which are relevant to the management of stormwater throughout Tasman as well as for Motueka. I've mentioned the RM 1910-19, which is the overall global consent. There's also the Urban Stormwater Strategy of August 2019, which is a key document in outlining stormwater actions in Tasman. For example, it mentions that every new development should look towards developing a 1% AUP or 1 in 100 year system of conveying stormwater away from the development. The Motueka Town Cash Management Plan was adopted 2 years ago. I think it was June 2022. It's a story map digitised. There's also the Tonkin and Taylor Motueka Flood Hazard Options Assessment of April 2022, which is a high level of flood mitigation options across the town. The Activity Management Plan of this year, and the Long-Term Plan this year to 34, and the Infrastructure Plan 2024 to 54 are also very pertinent for this development in terms of, particularly the last few, costing of likely drains. These papers and reports provide guidance and the basis for a new development area like Motueka, that's Motueka West, to be assessed for its stormwater needs and for the various options to protect or mitigate a heavy rain event. In the case of Motueka West, this also requires to consider the stormwater discharge into that existing woodlands drain. The Tonkin and Taylor report, page 10, states Motueka West has been identified as a future growth area, for which stormwater management optioneering is being developed separately. My requests for this report have not been successful, but I heard today that I shall now receive one of those. So thank you for considering my submission and statement. And I've mentioned the photographs of the culvert. And I've included also at the rear of my other statement, 2 maps. These are from the Tonkin and Taylor report. One shows Motueka and the likelihood what is shown as a 100-year RCP 8.5 2019 rainfall event and mean high water spring 6 at baseline maximum flood levels. And the one further on shows basically the same sort of map, but with sea level rise at 1 metre. So the difference is important. And I show that to indicate that at times I get the impression, and I have said this in my sort of additional notes, there's maybe a negative attitude from council staff, council officers towards the stormwater feature of Motueka. And I don't really understand this on the line, particularly those 2 maps which Tonkin and Taylor, engineering consultants for the council, have produced. And the final map, if you like, is that from 1842. And I put it there because it shows the extent of the Maori or iwi involvement in the part of Motueka which is Motueka West. I haven't indicated the streets because it's not been easy to do that. But in the middle you can see the area which is called Timatu. And quite a bit of Timatu is part of Motueka West. And those areas which shown as 221, 222, 208, 192, 223, 207 were the occupation reserves, or are the occupation reserves, which were part of the tenth claim. And just to highlight, the Samuel Stevens in 1842 was the professional registered surveyor for the New Zealand company, and it was on the basis of that map that the agreement was made between iwi, New Zealand company, and later on the Crown, again, which is part of the 10th concern. I just thought that might be of interest to different people. So I'm open to any questions, Mr. Ray.
Thank you for that, Mr. Oakley. I've got a couple of questions. I'll just hand over to the panel first of all. Commissioner Maru.
Mine will be to staff in response to the 7.
Yeah, that's right, Mr. Ogilvie. The staff will respond to that. But I'd just like to acknowledge the effort you put into preparing the submission, and you've clearly got a lot of local knowledge, and that's fully acknowledged. And thank you very much for giving us all this information. I guess as a panel, our job is to determine whether this parcel of land should be rezoned for medium density housing, because we've been told there's quite a significant need for that. And the issues you've highlighted probably relate to the whole of the Motueka West development area, and the council will be hopefully well aware of those concerns. So the issue for us is, first of all, whether the land should be rezoned ahead of the rest being developed, I guess. Whether the resource consent process is sufficiently robust to pick up the key concerns you've raised. And also, we're interested to know whether there are any particular aspects that should be in the provisions now. You know, in other words, things that are so important that they shouldn't be left to a resource consent stage. So that the other things we're exploring as part of this process. But thank you very much, and we'll look forward to the response from staff when they do their reply report.
Just a question, perhaps for myself, in terms of just what you've said, Mr. Ray, transport and stormwater and the impact of a plan change from rural one to residential, they should be two quite important aspects of any plan change rezoning decision, I would expect.
That's right. We understand the underlying zoning is rural, but it's a deferred zoning.
Deferred residential.
Yeah, so it's been earmarked, if you like, for development. But it also raises the issue of the highly productive land, which is something you have raised in discussion.
Yes.
And there is the national policy statement for HPL does have provisions in there where land has been identified for future urban development. It's excluded from being considered as HPL. But you know, the points you make about it still being productive land are pertinent. So, you know, thank you for that.
In my own mind, I was trying to work out just what would be the factors, how the panel could decide against a plan change of the rezoning. And I would have thought that things like the highly productive land and transportation effects and stormwater effects and probably two other factors could also be involved in that decision. Do we say yay or do we say no, or do we say yes with conditions? And hence my concern with particularly stormwater, not to the same degree with transportation. Thank you.
So thank you very much for making those points. All right, well, look, we'll have a response to your submissions from the officers in due course, but we've also got Mr. Neville from Kainoura, who's here. Thank you for coming along, Mr. Neville. I've had the privilege of having you present to me down in Waimakariri recently, so thank you for coming along. We've got your statement and it's in your hands how you wish to present that.
Kia ora koutou. And just a quick introduction. So I'm Joshua Neville and Team Leader of Development Planning for the South Island for Kainoura. So yeah, represent as well in other areas. I'm authorised to present this evidence today on behalf of Kainoura to support our primary submission on Plan Change 80 for Motueka West. We've not lodged legal submissions or other expert evidence for this hearing stream. And at sections 3 and 4 of my evidence, I provided an introduction to Kainoura in context for our involvement in Plan Change 80. As well as Tasman and more specifically Motueka for the benefit of the panel. To summarise, Kainoura, we were established in 2019 as a Crown agent under the Kainoura Homes and Communities Act. We have two core roles. One is delivering social housing and being a responsible landlord as agent for the Crown. And secondly, partnering to lead and facilitate urban development projects of all sizes. So nationally, we have a portfolio of 75,000 homes, and that provides housing for 191,000 customers in their whānau. In Tasman, we currently manage, and I address in my evidence in section 4 the changing needs of our portfolio and why we need to reconfigure this. I also address the demand in Tasman, as I think it's pertinent to this plan change, and how this has outpaced our ability to provide homes in the region, and why it's important to provide homes in Motueka. In Motueka specifically, we're struggling to develop new housing. As I highlight in table 1, most of our existing homes are in clusters and are not suitable for redevelopment, as they're either recently constructed or they are on sites that are subject to natural hazards. We're therefore seeking sites that are well located and hazard-free. And we also promote the upzoning and increased density on such sites generally. Our submission is generally supportive of Plan Change 80 as notified. and primarily sought changes to the zoning extent of the plan change and where the application of the comprehensive residential density provisions are. The proposed development that Plan Change 80 will create will greatly support a much needed housing supply in Motueka, and it is an innovative solution. We've supported that not only through the Infrastructure Acceleration Fund, which is an arm's length part of Kāinga Ora, but also in other ways. Kāinga Ora would like to support this development going ahead. With respect to the matters where we sought changes, that has been with relation to the policy and the zoning extent to enable comparable density provisions to be overlaid on the remainder of the residential land identified in the future development strategy as site T190. This land, if you've been out to site, is well suited for intensification and rezoning. This land would be in alignment with the National Policy Statement for Urban Development. With respect to the matters covered in my evidence, I've responded to the points of the Section 42A report of Ms. McKenzie at the time. So, and Kāinga really contested that those matters were not grounds alone to discount our proposed area from being rezoned. As covered in Section 7 of my evidence, there's solutions to address the issues that were raised, both infrastructure sufficiency and minor levels of risk can be addressed in site-specific ways. These are already enabled through the Nelson Tasman Land Development Manual and are required of the Building Act. In making a submission on Plan Change 80, Kāinga Ora supports a framework that is enabling of residential development, and in particular development at a higher density in a well-located area of Motueka. We believe this can be achieved not only on the site proposed by Plan Change 80, but also the surrounding residential sites immediately adjacent to this, thus giving effect to the FDS and also the NPSUD. If controls in the plan are set right, and sufficient flexibility is provided to enable housing variety and choice within respective zones, you can still have the anticipated urban form outcomes of those sites. We do own multiple sites in this area. They all represent a very limited number of sites where we may have an enabling planning pathway to an tolerable level of hazard risk. And sort of in conclusion, we appreciate the intent and hopefully the outcome of Plan Change 80. We believe that the adjustments to the extents that we seek will enhance the Tasman Resource Management Plan's ability to help deliver housing outcomes that are much needed in Tasman, as well as providing an anticipated and appropriate urban form in this area. And just to touch briefly on matters of scope and natural justice. So I contend that the relief that we seek is within scope. The area that is sought is covered under the future development strategy up to T190. This area was referred to throughout the notified Section 32A report. It is covered in Section 3.5 of the notification report of the plan change to the council. Likewise, there's policy changes in Plan Change 80 that will affect the sites that Kāinga Ora are proposing to be included. We lodged a public submission in a notified process that included all neighbours. This was able to be further submitted upon. We also met with Tasman District Council. We did raise at the time any concerns that the staff may have had about scope early in the process, and this was not discussed as an issue, nor were we informed that it would later be an issue. And I note that other panels have recently considered the matters with respect to natural justice, particularly through the intensification planning instrument processes throughout New Zealand, with relationship to extents and heights and abilities for people to submit on those processes. Notably, you know, I haven't had quite time to go into the detail, but Western Bay of Plenty and I know Lower Hutt panels found that notification, submission and further submission did represent an opportunity for natural justice. I also note the Environment Court decision with respect to Motueka and versus Palmerston North District Council. And in that particular issue, adjacency was discussed at length by the Environment Court, and it found in that case that the request of the party to be within scope and that the plan change here mirrors to some extent what was being sought. Finally, with respect to the changes, the built form standards are not particularly impacted by this change. In many instances, the sites will already be adjacent to the density controls being outlined here. Backing on to the fields that Plan Change 80 covers. We also own a number of the sites that do, that are adjacent to that, towards the High Street end of the corner. And yeah, we've made the submission. So on that note, I'm happy to take any questions of the panel.
Just on the last verbal introduction of the scope, you've responded to the scope issues. We would appreciate having that in writing. I don't think we'll be asking for a legal opinion because I think that sort of goes outside the process, but I think it's valid to get what you've just told us written down in written form for us. And just, we'll be asking the officer to respond, and Ms. McKenzie, you may wish to have more time to consider that properly. You may wish to see the written notes of what was just presented, but what I could ask you, Mr. Neville, is that one of the points you made is that you lodged a submission seeking this land to be rezoned, so that's in the public realm. And then there's a further submission process, isn't there, where people can respond to that. What I'm interested to know from the council is what was the notification procedure? Were landowners normally notified of individual plan changes or not? Would the owners have been served anything, or was it just a public notice that they need to be aware of?
We served a public notice. During the pre-consultation, we did send letters to adjoining landowners.
No, and in terms of what was notified, was the notification package sent to individual landowners?
No.
No, okay. And this is not a criticism. I'm just trying to understand what went on, because this is relevant as to whether we're satisfied that local people who live in the area could reasonably have been aware of a request to expand the zoned area to potentially come right up to their boundaries or not. And if they had been served the documents, it's possible you could argue that, but it seems like that's not the case. Is that right? Okay, all right. Okay. Well, look, we'll leave that particular issue for now, but yeah, Mr. Neville, if you can just furnish us with some with written confirmation of what you've presented, that would assist. And we may ask the officer to respond at a later date once it's been more fully considered. But thank you for that. I'll just check if the panel have any questions on the rest of your submission, which was more to do with servicing and so forth. Do you Thank you very much for that presentation, and I take on board your comments about the NPSUD and how through the course of the hearings in the Waimakariri district, for instance, we've been considering rezoning of land that's at quite lengthy distances from a central area. That this site this land immediate around it is certainly near the centre of the town, and that's one key aspect that would tend to support your argument about it being generally consistent with the NPSUD. But I guess the powers of this panel are to look at this piece of land and to see how far we can extend that jurisdiction, if at all. So that's what we'll be considering. But thank you very much. We have no further questions of you. Thank you. All right, look, we'll take a brief adjournment now for a cup of tea, and also to give the officers a chance to digest what they've heard. And again, if you wish to have some more time, we're happy to take a more lengthy break. So, do you think sort of half an hour might be sufficient to present, or are you ready to go?
Half an hour would be great.
Okay, great. Okay, we'll reconvene at it's at 12 o'clock, is it? Yeah, reconvene at 12 o'clock. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, everyone. We'll reconvene the hearing to hear from the officers and their reply. Are you ready to go? Very good.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks, Ms. McKenzie. Well, in your hands.
Thank you for the opportunity to comment, and thank you to the submitters for presenting today. With regards to Mr. Ogilvy's concerns around stormwater, I'm comfortable with our officer's response in this, and that it can be managed through the consenting process. So I have nothing further to say on that. In response to Mr. Taylor's comments on behalf of Wakapu, regarding Rule 17.1.3.3, amendment, his request to amend the requirement for subdivision and land use consent to be applied for concurrently. We accept the principle, but as this is quite an unusual situation, I think we're going to need some further discussions with the landowner and our subdivisions planning team, just to determine an appropriate change to the Tasman Resource Management Plan. Leasehold arrangements have some limited timeframes in the Resource Management Act. I think it's about 35 years. So we just need to have some further discussions as to how that may work. But I reiterate that in principle we accept this point, and I'm confident that we can find a drafting solution to it.
So just to be clear, you're recommending we accept that submission and to devise an appropriate provision. Would you be liaising with Mr. Taylor, for instance, to develop that?
Yes, correct.
Yeah. Okay.
I think we would need to, yeah.
All right. Thank you for that.
With regards to Ms. Taylor's second point, which is understood, and it's fair, as the consent process requires that owners and occupiers to provide written consent, and we understand the concern with this. However, instead of preparing a bespoke set of rules and adding complexity to the Tasman Resource Management Plan, I would suggest that the landowner could obtain a land use consent that provides a generic approval to exempt them from the internal boundary limitations prior. If they were to do this before the adjoining superlots are occupied by a third party, then this would cover their concerns there. So we're happy to discuss this further with Mr. Taylor if required. And finally, in response to Mr. Neville's comments around the out of scope, as mentioned, I'm just going to confirm that we did send pre-notification letters to adjoining neighbours, but they were not sent letters once the plan change was notified. It was just a public notice. My scope response still stands, but I just wanted to make an additional point that other stakeholders may need to be considered in this situation, such as Wakatahi, if we were to extend the area, and I just wanted that point to be noted.
So that's something the panel discussed in the break actually is, so aside from natural justice issues, is there enough information for us to be confident that the traffic, stormwater, other effects of zoning additional land, is that information in front of the panel at this stage, or has it been provided in the way of evidence to give us confidence that zoning additional land will not have adverse effects? Have you got any response to that?
So sorry. So your question.
Oh, sorry, my question is: we've dealt with the issues of natural justice,
Yes.
but in terms of whether there's merit in rezoning additional land beyond what we've got in front of us, has there been any assessment provided of what the traffic impacts would be of doubling the size of the zone, that sort of thing?
No. There's
okay.
no,
Right.
and as I mentioned in my Section 42A report, there's concerns around stormwater and also around the climate, natural hazards, inundation to some of the sites, not all of them.
Just see if that's it. Thank you very much. Yeah, thank you for that. We'll just see if there's any questions of the panel.
I've just got one relating to stormwater, and if David Stevenson, I think he's on Zoom, if he's able to respond.
Yes,
Right, Mr. Stevenson, just in the submission from David Ogilvy, in one of the paragraphs, he estimates the capacity of the woodlands drain at only 1 in 10 years. And I'm just wondering if you'd like to comment on that, because I thought the capacity was, from previously, you'd said there was still capacity.
Yes, in terms of within channel, that's probably a reasonable estimate, is that it's 10-year capacity in terms of within the channel. I'd need to go away and I could look at some material I've got now and just quickly check that, but that would be a reasonable estimate. Beyond 10-year flows, we already get general overland flooding, sort of in that area between the Thorpe drain to the east and the Woodlands Creek. But I'll see if I can pull up a document just to check that now.
Well, if you could come back to us before we finish, if you can find that document.
Yep, I will do that.
Sorry, David, while you're looking for that document, also when you come back, if you could also, Mr. Sheaves' evidence said that the treatment and retention and the development that was going on in the proposed plan change area was going to actually mitigate and reduce stormwater runoff from the west. So can you just confirm that that's your understanding as well? Thanks.
Yep, that is my understanding. Of course, the consent process hasn't finished, but that's where we're at the moment. That's the information we have from their engineer, and we've reviewed that information.
All right, thank you for that. Well, but I'll just recap on what where we stand as with things. Mr. Neville is going to provide in writing his right of reply to us, and it'd be good if that could be done reasonably soon, isn't it? Is that feasible within a couple of days? Is it? Oh, thank you very much. So that's the first action, and when that arrives, the officers will be able to look at that as well. And then what I'd like is for Ms. McKenzie to give us your reply in writing. It can be note form, it doesn't have to be lengthy, but just so we've got something in front of us to outline those. I think there were 3 matters you raised with us, so if we can have that in writing, and if you can consider Mr. Neville's statement first and then prepare that. So I don't know, a week or something like that. Would that be okay? So that's the second item, and then there's also the matters that Mr. David Stevenson, Mr. Stevenson, your matters. If you can just include that with Ms. McKenzie's reply, just pass that information to her, and she can send that to us. And then once we've got that information, the panel will have a look at it, and we'll issue any further directions about meeting with Mr. Taylor and so forth. We'll determine whether that's required or not, and then we'll issue directions at that point. So
I'm happy to show you. I've got that information around Woodlands Drain now. I could show that on the screen if that's
okay.
helpful.
Yes, if you've got that, that's one less thing to do later. Thank you.
Okay, if you let me know once you can see my screen.
It's quite remote from us, so if you can make it any larger, it's going to come up there, is it? Okay.
Right, so this is some modelling we commissioned for the looking at the pipe here. So this is the 10% or the 10-year event without any development, so the existing situation. So you can see along, here's Woodland Drain, and it's staying generally within the channel, but there's some ponding off on the Thorpe Drain side of things. And this here is where, if you can see my pointer, this is where the new pipe comes in here. So you can see there's a little bit of ponding there. Now, if we look at the 100-year event, so that's this next page here, you can see that even before any development, you've got a bit of overtopping here and some overtopping down here as well. So once you get to a 100-year event, you've got some ponding to the west of Woodlands Stream, and you've got this flooding through here. So then if we, so that's sort of an overall, gives you a view of the capacity of Woodlands Drain. So yes, certainly within the 10-year event, but we didn't model a 20-year event. But once you're into that Q100 event, then yeah, there's reasonably extensive flooding.
Thank you for that. Does that satisfy your question?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So there's no need to. Okay. Unless there's anything else anyone wants to raise, I think we can adjourn the hearing. So thank you, everyone. Involvement is appreciated. And once we have that information, we'll issue further directions if need be. Thank you very much.